Welcome to my show. I am with a guest here. His name is Emmanuel Blanchard. Emmanuel, how are you doing, sir?
Doing really well. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that you're doing well. And it's a pleasure to be invited on your show. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, sir. So, firstly, we know you are an educator. We know you are a writer. We also know you are a educator counselor. Can you walk us through the journey, how it started, and how it's going currently now, sir?
Yeah. So I live in the United States. I live in New York City, and my parents are from the Caribbean. And as I'm sure most of your followers know, that it's important that when your family, someone in your family decides that they're going to leave home, it's a big decision that they're making. And so my parents decided they were going to leave their home in the Caribbean, and they found their way to New York City. And the reason why they left was all because of education. So where they were from, getting education was very difficult. It was very expensive. A public school system did not exist there, and so every time my siblings and I woke up, they shared with us the stories of how difficult it was for them to get an education, and that the only reason why they left everything behind, they left family members behind, they left their towns behind, they left parents behind, was because of education. And so growing up and hearing this every single day, it kind of meant something important to me to know that my parents had made such a huge sacrifice, and to know that the reason why they did it was because of the ability for me and my siblings to be able to sit in a classroom. So many, many years later, after having gone to school and seeing the sacrifices that my parents made, I wanted to be able to advocate in the same way for people like myself and for communities like my own, because education is something that should not be taken for granted, especially because it's not available everywhere.
All right, sir. Can you also walk us through your journey for almost 20 years as a public educator? Can you walk us through how you achieved that 20 years, sir?
Yeah, so I had the fortunate pleasure of going to some really great schools, and the amazing thing about education in the United States is that um, education in the United States is very, very, very fascinating because it's not everyone who gets a quality education. And so I was able to see some really, really great portions of education in the United States. And I was also able to see some like, wait, why didn't I get this opportunity? And so having had a chance to go to some Ivy League schools, and really seeing the best of the best and the creme de la creme, I decided that I wanted to be an agent of change. And so for the past 20 years, I've been working in different schools in the United States. And one of the things that I've noticed is that there are really, really, excuse me, there are really huge differences in terms of the kinds of education a child here in the States can receive, based upon what kind of teachers they get, based upon what kind of schools they go to, based upon the kind of neighborhoods they grow up in. And so my career for the past 20 years has really been about finding ways to ensure that every kid, no matter skin color, no matter how much money their family makes, no matter where they live, my mission has become to really ensure that kids get the best possible education, particularly those for whom it's already been decided they don't deserve the best education.
All right. So, do you have any book on the radar? Do you have any book you've written, or do you have any book you are planning to write, or you don't have it in mind currently, sir?
I actually, it's funny that you asked that. I'm actually in, and this is actually the first time I'm announcing this, so this is actually pretty big. I'm actually in the process of writing a couple of books. One is going to look at the disparities that exist in public education in the United States, from the standpoint of a person of color. There have been a lot of people who've written books, a lot of people who've written books on education, but they're not that many that look like me. They're not that many who write from the perspective of someone who, who's a black man, who's a child of an immigrant, who is someone who's worked in New York City and also worked in the suburbs of New York City. There not have been that many books written from men of color who come from a background where they've gone to Ivy League schools and they get to see the insights of how schools work. So one of the books that I'm currently working on, as a matter of fact, I have a huge writing session later on today. One of the books I'm writing on is what is happening so that public schools are where they are right now, and how can local neighborhoods address the issues that local neighborhoods are facing with regards to money being pulled from public schools, how a lot of efforts are being made to make public schools less of a viable option for local communities. So I'm really, really, really very excited about this book project. I'm hoping to be done writing this book within the next few months. It's a huge, huge, huge process. I can't wait to actually be finished with it. But it is a to really for really to like have something that I think that will be worthwhile. And I don't want to just write a book where people read it and they don't have something they can do with it afterwards. So really the hardest part about it is making sure that when people read it, they have something they can do next with it. They have something or plan that they can attach to their local community. So yes, I'm very, very excited to announce that. It's been a long, long time, and I've had a lot of people push me and say, "Where's the book?" It's being written. It's being written as we speak, and this is the first time I've said this publicly. So I have to make sure that it gets finished by the end of this year. So I'm very excited to announce that.
All right, so I also wish you the best of luck, sir. So,
Thank you.
I want to ask, in your own understanding, how can you define diversity in context of education?
That's a great question. I was actually having a conversation about this with other people about this very question. Um, Diversity is a word that, depending on your context, it makes people feel very uncomfortable because diversity does several things. The first thing it does is that it destabilizes the power structure that exists. So, all societies, all cultures, all communities have people in power, whether they're elected or whether it's just generational power, or even if it's like just institutional power. How communities are set up is that there are people who have the ability to tell others or to shape the lives of others, and really to shape their everyday life. What diversity is, it's not just skin color. It's not just someone's gender. It's not just someone's age. Diversity is who's in the room. Oftentimes, the people in power, and this has been my experience having lived in the United States for all of my life, and to like studying the history of those who've been historically in power in my local society. Most of the time, when people are making decisions, they tend to surround themselves with people who look just like them. So, for example, in the case of the United States, it's often been rich white men who are of a particular age, who tend to be older. And that's been the story of the United States for more than 300 years, even before the United States was a country. What diversity is that it encourages and it actually like asks the question, how can someone who does not necessarily look like me, sound like me, have had the experiences that I've had, will have or have not had the experiences that I will have? How can you be best suited to make those decisions for me? Wouldn't it make more sense for more people to be part of the decision making process? So diversity for me, and as I've been doing this work in education, part of my work is to really dismantle the fear that people have when they hear the word diversity. It's about embracing the idea of having more people involved in the decision making process. Because the other part of it that I've often noticed, and I'm thinking this might be a question that you're about to ask, is there are benefits to diversity that people who have power often miss because of the fear that if I open up the room to people who don't look like me, who don't sound like me, who don't act like me, who don't think like me, that naturally must mean that I will lose power. That is not necessarily true.
All right. So what role do you think parents can play in promoting diversity in education, sir?
That's a great question. One of the issues that we often have in education is that um, we often make choices without realizing that there are more options. And you know, when I speak to parents, one of the things that I always tell them is that the rules are local to where you are. The options are often local to where you are. But the responsibility that you have is to ensure that you know as many of the options as possible. Um, one of the things that often happens is that if you go to a restaurant, a lot of times we just look at the menu and like we just decide from the menu. But in many quality restaurants, there's sometimes a secret menu, a menu that if you've been going there a long time, they'll tell you there are additional options you don't see. Have you done the work to investigate to see are there additional options? So I use that metaphor with respect to education as well, is that oftentimes parents may not know that there are additional options for your child, but that every decision you make or every decision that you don't make will often craft or lead your child in a particular direction that once they get to be about 14, 15, 16, 17, a lot of the decisions you've already made have already kind of led them down a path that might either grow or limit their options, their future options, their career options, their educational options. So one of the things that I always encourage parents to do, especially parents who are disadvantaged, especially parents who come from communities where they're not represented in the decision making process, is ask questions. One of the things that people in power always do is they ask questions. People who are disempowered tend to look at what's there and just simply see this is the only option that I have. Those in power always ask this question: well, what can you do for me? And that's part of the psychology of breaking down power, is that you look at what already exists and you say, but I know that there's more that's possible. So that's the one thing I always advise to parents is whenever you walk into a room, ask the question, well, what can you do for me? And keep on asking that question because I guarantee you that there are additional options that may exist for you and your family, and in particular, your students, your kids.
All right, sir. So how can curriculum activities of schools, and also some teaching methods that can be done, how can it better serve diverse students?
That's a good question. It's a really good question. I find that a lot of people, and I'll use my local cultural context. I find that a lot of people don't always know what school is or what school is supposed to be. So, for example, here in the States, a lot of Americans perceive school to be I go to school, I get a job. And actually, if you look at what schools are historically, that is not what schools were ever meant to be. Schools were never meant to be a pipeline from, you go to class, from 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock or 7 o'clock to 2:30. And then after you graduate, you're directly slotted into a job. Um, Before there were public schools in the United States, there were private schools that were set up for the elite, for the rich, for the really, really rich of Americans. And those schools were set up to, here's the funny part, they were set up to create people who could think. So many of the classes, the kinds of classes that the founders went to, for example, a Benjamin Franklin or a Thomas Jefferson, these were supposed to be, and Alexander Hamilton is another person. They were supposed to be thinkers. They were supposed to be problem solvers. And so I think this is one of the issues that many of us fall into is that we go to school or we send our kids to school or we have this idea of what school is, and it's not really what school was originally supposed to be. And now we've developed these versions of schools where kids kind of go through them and parents have kids who go through them, but they're not quite sure what they're supposed to be. It's I get a 100. I get an A. I want you to take the hardest classes, but it's about grades and it's not about the thought. It's not about thinking. It's not about problem solving. So, in terms of figuring out curriculum and its relationship to diversity, one of the things that I would always suggest to parents is just don't rely on your school to be a teacher. That is one of the fundamental mistakes that parents make when it comes to education, is that they view the school or they view schools as the only source of education. The best students I've ever taught, the best students I've ever taught were students, were readers who read outside of school, were musicians and artists outside of school, were coding and designing websites and designing and designing AI. They were doing it outside of school. They were learning even when school wasn't happening. And here's the other thing I've noticed: parents of those kids created an environment where that was the expectation. I want you to read. I want you to practice an instrument. I want you to learn another language. I want to travel with you just so you can see other parts of the world. And here's what I mean. Is what I really mean about that one too. Not just like the resort part of a place, or like the pretty part of the place. I want you to see the real parts of the world so you get a broader understanding of how the world works. So I think curriculum is just one portion of learning, but I think the other ingredient is, are you making someone, or do we have kids who are thirsty to learn about the world around them? That's really, really important. And what we have right now, especially because we could talk about cell phones, we could talk about social media, we have many things that can take away that thirst for knowledge, that no matter what you do in curriculum, once that thirst for knowledge is gone, the curriculum becomes irrelevant, because all of a sudden, if I have a kid who's just fascinated with TikTok and doesn't want to do anything else, they're not going to learn. It has to be that you have to create a child who wants to learn, and then curriculum becomes an avenue for diversity.
All right, sir. So, in technology world that we are today, how
Mhm.
can technology be leveraged to support this diversity? How can technology be balanced to it?
That's a really good question too. I think one of the things that we have to look at is, um, technology technology is exactly what it is. It's a tool. However, since, and I'm old enough to remember a world without social media. I remember like the first forms of social media, for example, MySpace. I remember what that was like when it first came out. I remember Black Planet. I remember, like, all of these like very early. I remember AOL Messenger. Um, and then Facebook came along and really changed. Um, it really changed how many of us view the role of social media and technology in our lives. The iPhone came, I think, around 2006, 2007, and it fundamentally changed how we view technology. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because, if you remember, I don't think you're old enough to remember this, but if you are, when MySpace first launched, a very curious thing happened. If you were using MySpace, you actually had to learn a little bit of coding to create your own social media site. And the best pages were the ones that had the music, the pictures, but you actually had to learn like HTML. Like you had average people who, because they wanted to make a statement, had to actually learn a new language, computer language. So in the early days of like that version of the internet in 2003, 2002, the average person had a basic understanding of like what coding was. Today, none of us, I mean, many of us don't code. Many of us don't do that. Like, we're more consumers as opposed to like end users. So like, if you're on Facebook, yes, you might produce content for Facebook, but you're not really the one in control of the space. You're just uploading stuff. Um, and I guess this is a long answer of just simply saying is that I think we're at a tipping point in terms of what technology is doing for us. Um, Many kids are producing content, but they're producing content for a social media platform. They're not necessarily producing a platform themselves. I think that's the real revolution that has to happen. Um, TikTok is massive, it's huge. X is massive, it's huge. IG is massive and huge. Facebook is massive and huge, both owned by Meta. However, that content after you upload it does not belong to you anymore. It ultimately belongs to those content platform hosts. So I think where we need to go is I think we've mastered the idea of creating content. I think we need to do a better job of creating platforms because that's where real power lies in terms of ownership and especially ownership of like really valuable resources.
All right, sir. Generally, what advice can you give someone who is new, who wants to go into teaching diverse students? What advice can you give them?
The biggest piece of advice, and it's funny because I've reached this point in my career now where I'm giving a lot of advice to young teachers. And I didn't know it would happen this quickly, but it has. The biggest piece of advice I would give is one, never assume that you've stopped learning. Never assume that you stopped needing to learn. I've been in education for more than 20 years now, and I work harder now than I ever did my first year of teaching. Maybe it's the content I teach because I'm a history person. I am constantly reminding myself I need to learn more about X. So I might be an expert in, for example, West Indian history, but I might know a lot about the Dominican Republic, but I need to learn a lot more about Martinique. I need to learn more about, Curacao. I need to learn more about, Central America. I need to know about what's happening in Honduras. I think you have to just simply embrace is if you embrace this idea of just being humbled and that you're constantly going to be learning, it often allows you to have a point of access to embrace your students to know, okay, while they're learning, I always remember what it feels like to be a learner as well. So that would be my biggest piece of advice is that always constantly be a learner.
All right, sir. Lastly, I there's a question I usually ask. So if there is
Mhm.
anything you will from the ancestors, there are a lot of things that happened in the past in our ancestors' time. If there's anything you would have loved to bring back to our current time, what do you think that thing would be, sir?
Whew. Community. Um, the idea that we are responsible for one another. I think globally, there's a wave of people who are more and more concerned for themselves. And there's nothing wrong with being worried about you. But me should not come at the expense of we. And I think that's one of the biggest concerns that I see happening politically, historically, culturally, in many pockets of the industrialized world, where we are so concerned about me that we'll do anything and everything to dismantle, to discourage, to disparage, um, individuals who are already suffering. So I think the biggest thing I would want to return back to is a greater sense of community than anything else.
All right, sir. From the bottom of my heart, I want to appreciate your time sir, for this little time you gave to me for my show. Thank you very
Absolutely.
much, sir. Thank you, sir.
It's a real pleasure, and I hope I have a chance to speak to you again. Thank you so much, and for anyone who's following, feel free to follow me on all socials, EJR_Blanchard. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
All right, bye bye.
Take care.